Hello, Dr. Johnson's sections of Psychology 101, Lincoln University of Missouri. I'm recording this for us on the afternoon of Friday, April 17th, 2020 at about 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And in this particular presentation, we're going to be looking at the slides in Chapter 3, PowerPoint 3, Neurotransmitters and How Drugs Work. So if you looked at the previous presentations, one of the things that we've been focusing on is the idea that neurotransmitters, the neurotransmitter chemicals that transmit information from either one neuron to another or one neuron to a piece of muscle fiber, have physical shape and size and construction. So for instance, here is an electron scanning microscope picture of a dopamine molecule. And dopamine is one of the big neurotransmitters in terms of psychological effects that we know a lot about, but we probably don't know everything about. And the thing that I'm asking you to pay attention to is that this shape, if this is a key, it's a very complex key. And other neurotransmitters and other drug molecules have shapes that are either more or less similar to this or more or less different than this. So I have in our Canvas page this file, table 150/02.01.jpg. And that's what we're looking at here in terms of a list of particular neurotransmitter chemicals, and we've got three columns. We've got the name of the neurotransmitter chemical. This list has 6. We've got the function or functions of the neurotransmitter chemical here. And then we've got sort of the signs and symptoms patterns of what happens if we've got too much or too little activity having to do with the particular neurotransmitter and its function. And we'll be looking at this, and I want you to look at this more than once. So on this list, we've got acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, which is short for an acronym for gamma-aminobutyric acid, and glutamate. And the first 4 of these are neurotransmitter chemicals that over the last 50 to 70 years we've built a pretty big knowledge base about some of the ways they function and some of the effects they have. These 2 are also mighty important, but our knowledge base of what they do and how they do it is a little bit newer, and we'll continue to build our mountain of knowledge about these things. As I said, this particular table lists 6 different individual neurotransmitters that, as we pointed out earlier, are just a few among 145 plus that have been identified so far. Again, they represent neurotransmitters that we know a fair amount about relatively, and stuff we understand is important and we're continuing to learn more about. one of the things I invite you to notice is that when you look at the columns that have to do with functions and imbalances, you see that some of the functions are extremely varied. That is, some of these neurotransmitter chemicals, the parts of our experience and behavior that they're heavily involved in is really varied. For instance, if we look at acetylcholine, we see that our table says it enables muscle action, learning, and memory. So if you think about muscle action, learning, and memory, that's a pretty wide variety of functions, like moving our muscles, helping us remember things both in terms of our explicit memory and our implicit memory, and learning, altering our explicit and implicit memories in terms of what we can do and the story that we tell about what we can do. So one of the things about this is that this wide range of functions for different neurotransmitter chemicals reflects the fact that the brain and the nervous system use the same neurotransmitters, the same chemical keys for different functions, for different locks in different parts of the brain and the nervous system. We're going to get back to that table of functions and imbalances. But before we do that, let's think for a moment. So far, up to this point, we've mostly been talking about individual neurons and the action potential going down individual neurons. But when we're talking about particular things that the individual neurotransmitters do and the drug effects that we see when the drug chemical key fits into the receptor site for the neurotransmitter chemical key, it becomes important to talk about neural pathways and nerves. We've been talking about nerves before. So, for instance, we go back and look at this opening shot from our neuron animation. We have, for a couple of different presentations, a couple of previous presentations, been highlighting the fact that these green cable-looking things are nerves. That is, bundles of neurons that are wrapped together by a fascia, by a biological wrapping, covering, and they extend outside the brain and through the nervous system. And we talked about the peripheral nervous system. Talked about the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves, the bundles of neurons that come out of the brain at the brainstem, travel down the spinal cord, and then branch off at various spots in the spinal cord and reach down both into our voluntary muscles, our hands and legs, and our more or less involuntary muscles, including the muscles that move our lungs. So nerves are bundles of neurons that tend to turn on and off together, and we tend to think of those bundles as nerves outside of the brain. but inside the brain, and they don't tend to be wrapped together by fascia, we still have bundles of neurons that work together, that turn on and off together. We call these neural pathways, and one of the things that's useful to think about in terms of how we're talking about this is that many of the neural pathways are batches of neurons that all use the same neurotransmitter chemicals to keep themselves either turned off or sometimes turn on. So, for instance, here's an illustration that we'll get back to in a little bit. Here's an illustration that compares in the brain the differences and the overlaps between pathways that are tuned to two of our most important psychologically neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine. Again, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but the way I am encouraging you to think about these at this point is that serotonin is a major mood regulation neurochemical, and it is for reasons that are kind of nuanced and complicated, and that dopamine is the major reward neurotransmitter chemical. So the thing I want you to notice right now is that, all right, so here are our dopamine pathways highlighted in blue. Here's our serotonin pathways highlighted in red. If we compare the way these two pathways map through the brain, we see that the serotonin in red extends through a larger area than the dopamine in blue. There's also some overlap between serotonin and dopamine. And when you're looking at this, there's a copy of this image that isn't embedded inside the PowerPoints that you can look at a little bit more clearly. But it tells us down here, here's the things that we know that dopamine does or is involved in. Here's the things we know that serotonin does, that it's involved in. And they are different sets of functions. Dopamine is reward, pleasure, motor function, including fine-tuning of motor function, the feeling of being compelled to do something behaviorally, and perseveration, which perseveration is a sort of fancy word for you start thinking about something and you start doing something and you don't quit thinking about doing that thing. While over here under serotonin, we've got mood, memory processing, sleep, and cognition. So if you think about over here, compulsion and perseveration, these are aspects of cognition, thought, but sort of generally we are ascribing different parts of this to the different neurotransmitters. Before we go on and talk a little bit more about why it's informative to think about neural pathways inside the brain and nerves extending outside the brain, I wanted to go back and catch us up on this term, long-term potentiation. So one of the things that we've been talking about axons, only one axon leaves the cell body, just one. But depending on the particular neuron, any given axon can branch off to an indefinite number of axon terminals. And these axon terminals will attach to one or more receiving neurons or piece of muscle fiber. And so we go back to this sort of idea of long-term potentiation. This term refers to physical changes that happen in the nervous system when we learn something new. And this applies whether we're talking about learning new explicit memory, information, relationships between words, vocabulary, and concepts, or whether we're practicing motor skills or learning new emotional reactions. It's happening in both instances. So one part of that long-term potentiation is that process of growing new axon terminals, like twigs coming off the axon and making new connections. A second part of long-term potentiation is that when we're talking about neurons that'll bundle together in either nerves or neural pathways, the more they repeatedly turn on together, the more they fire together, the easier it is for them all to fire together, the more efficient their joint actions become. So repeated experience, repeated practice, whether we're talking about muscle actions or whether we're talking about verbal information, the more it's practiced, the more easily it happens. The next part, we've mentioned this before, but let's come back to it. Inside the brain, and actually outside the brain in the nerves, certain sets of neural pathways use particular neurotransmitters. But these pathways overlap and influence each other. So here in the PowerPoints, I've got one illustration that side by side again shows the difference between the serotonin pathways and the dopamine pathways. And again, two things to look at are A, they're not exactly the same, but B, they do overlap. A bunch of stuff that's going on in this particular illustration. And as I pointed out before, if you follow the path of the serotonin related neurons in red, they extend through a bigger proportion of the brain than the dopamine pathways in blue. But there's some overlap, and a particular place where this overlap is important is this particular part of the hypothalamus, called the nucleus accumbens. And then there's also overlap here in the hippocampus, which we know is associated with memory. Just to remind ourselves, we're looking at what are the functions and examples of imbalances of the different neurotransmitters. And the illustration we've been looking at shows the differences and the overlaps between where in the brain the pathways that utilize the neurotransmitters dopamine and serotonin occur. So for dopamine, our functions are movement, learning, which sometimes includes movement but doesn't always include movement when we're talking about explicit memory, attention, which I again encourage you to think of as huge, and emotion, how we feel about things. And then serotonin, overall mood, hunger, sleep, and overall arousal. So if you think about these different aspects of our experience and behavior, it's like it's clear that these are related, but they're not exactly the same. So now let's look at the examples of imbalances. So too much serotonin is linked to the mental disorders that are grouped under the overall heading of schizophrenia, and an undersupply is linked to tremors and the decreased mobility in Parkinson's disease. So in this introductory aspect, it's like one of the things that I really would like you to think about is that, like, okay, this set of disorders is all about cohesive mental processing of the information coming in from our environment and how that directs our reactions to the environment, both emotionally, mentally, and behaviorally. So too much dopamine activity is like, oh, we become disorganized in terms of our ability to put together information about the environment. On the other hand, not enough, too much dopamine activity gives us these very physical symptoms: lack of fine motor control and decreased mobility, which is associated with Parkinson's disease. So the schizophrenia part has to do with attention and emotion. Too much dopamine in schizophrenia, too much activity interferes with our ability to control and direct our attention and our emotional responses to the things that we're paying attention to, whereas too little activity as is happening when we've got Parkinson's disease, is involved with dopamine being involved in movement. Let's go back to serotonin now, in the red. Mood, memory processing, sleep, and cognition. And again, they both overlap. And I want to draw your attention again to the fact that they overlap in this spot called the nucleus accumbens, which is one structure within a larger structure called the hypothalamus, under the thalamus. And the thing about the nucleus accumbens is it's the major reward center of the brain. So there's some stuff, if you're looking over the table, and I want you to look over the table, in addition to the functions in table 2.1, there's some additional stuff that I want you to remember. One is that dopamine is the major reward chemical. Anytime we have any kind of experience that makes us go, yes, I want more of that, dopamine is involved. If it's like, whether it's your first kiss, whether it's sinking a 3-point shot, whether it's watching your son or daughter score a goal in soccer, whether it's getting a bonus on your paycheck. If your experience is excited reward, then dopamine is involved. And specifically, dopamine is working in this particular part of the brain that we call the nucleus accumbens. It's related, but it's not exactly the same thing. If what we want to do is maintain over the long period of time a relatively stable, good mood, then we want to make sure that we've got enough serotonin activity. And again, we're looking at serotonin neuron extensions into the nucleus accumbens, our reward center in the brain. Go back to our list of things that the different neurotransmitters do. Again, we see such a wide variety of effects for including. So I'm highlighting for us, I'm highlighting mood, but we've also got hunger, sleep, and overall arousal. In terms of what we know about different neurotransmitters, serotonin is, to me, super interesting. Partly because one of the things we know about the amount of these serotonin neurotransmitter chemicals we've got in our nervous system, most of them are at work in the gut, having to do with digestion. But look here, up in the brain, away from the stomach, and we see that one of the things this illustration is telling us is that the entire top layer of the brain, the entire cerebral cortex, is saturated with serotonin receptor sites. Okay, so here's some other things I want you to keep in mind above and beyond our 6 neurotransmitter chart. We've talked about this one before. Again, this is an oversimplification. Anandamide is not just one of 2 endocannabinoids. Anandamide is one of like 120 something active chemical ingredients that we have so far identified in cannabis, in stuff that the cannabis plant grows. Endorphins are endo-opiates. Norepinephrine on this chart is identified as helping control alertness and arousal, and it says an undersupply can depress mood. So more specifically than this chart informs us, I want you to recall that norepinephrine is the major fight or flight neurotransmitter. And again, going back and trying to catch us up on like the specifics of what all this means. We said that anandamide is an endocannabinoid, cannabis-related compound. And we said that endorphins are endogenous opiates. What do we mean when we use this particular prefix? And what it means is that whatever it is that we're putting this prefix onto the word is that it means that we've got a naturally occurring in our bodies neurotransmitter that our body manufactured, that there are drug molecules that we can ingest that fit into the receptor sites and turn up the activity in the neurons that are tuned to that drug molecule, that neurotransmitter molecule. So for instance, when we talk about endorphins, endorphin is short for endogenous morphine. And the fact that these neurotransmitters exist in our natural neurochemistry was something that was discovered, I believe, only in the 1970s. And so it wasn't until the 1970s that we got this very important clue as to why it is that the opiate and the opioid drugs, the opiate drugs, which are derived from the opium poppy. So that's going to be in increasing terms of strength. Opium, morphine, and then heroin do the things they do is because they are chemical keys that fit into locks for this natural painkiller, endorphins, that our bodies produce. Just like in the 1990s, we discovered anandamide, one of the things that a chemical compound that is involved in the fact that for many people, smoking or otherwise ingesting cannabis is rewarding because it changes the way we feel about things. It's the same basic principle. There's a drug molecule that mimics the action of a neurotransmitter molecule that our body naturally produces. At this point, for this class this year, I don't spend as much time as I've spent in the past in previous syllabi for talking about different kinds of drug actions. But what we've been outlining, mostly what we've been focusing on, is that for a lot of drugs of recreation and abuse, they do the things they do to us because the drug molecule chemical is shaped enough like a naturally produced, endogenously produced neurotransmitter molecule that it fits into a receptor site. The receptor sites are the locks. Unlocks the receptor site that is, when we're talking about this kind of drug action, the agonistic drug action, it's like it's an excitatory, it's a turn on molecule and mimics the neurotransmitter's action. It's just that there's a lot more of it compared to what our basic neurochemistry would produce without the interference of the drug molecule. So here's some examples of drugs with this. The drug molecule fits into the lock that's built for the neurotransmitter, the agonistic action. Nicotine, the major active ingredient in tobacco, fits into receptor sites for acetylcholine in the brain. We've already talked about cannabis, THC, at anandamide receptors. The pain-killing drugs, opiate and opioid drugs, at endorphin receptors. And as an aside, LSD, it's serotonin receptors in the brain. There's more examples. This is a short list, but it really starts to show us and drive home like, okay, so when people are affected psychologically by drugs, there's very much a logic as to why and how that happens. We'll pick up with sort of more particular effects and extensions, ramifications of this in the next presentation.